Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second Campfire of 2021. Welcome to Rebel Book Club. Welcome to all our Rebel Book Clubbers who are joining us. I see lots of familiar faces in the chat, joining from all over the place. Let us know where you are and, more importantly, what you're putting in your pancakes. But to begin this evening, I'm really excited to welcome to Rebel Book Club Kendra Pierre-Louis. Kendra, for those that haven't met or come across Kendra's writing before or work, is a senior climate reporter with Gimlet and Spotify podcast, which I've been listening to recently, called How to Save a Planet, which is hosted, I believe, by Ayana, who also packaged this whole All We Can Save project together. I was listening to it on a walk this morning. It's a great thing, and lockdown walking and podcasts. And prior to that, she was a climate reporter in the New York Times, staff writer with PopSci, where she wrote about science, environment, and occasionally mayonnaise, which she rants about on Twitter. And lots more besides. Prior to being involved with the All We Can Save project, Kendra wrote Greenwash, Why We Can't Buy Our Way to a Green Planet. Kendra, welcome to Rebel Book Club. Great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
You are in New York, right?
I'm in coastal New England, actually. I quarantine moved. I'm normally in New York, and I will be back in New York in September. But I kind of knew last summer that the second wave was going to happen, and there would be really bad, and so I just moved to the ocean for the year.
Good. So you got a bit closer to real nature there. And what's your state of mind, and how are you feeling right now? How are you doing?
Well, I don't know. I feel like better than most, I feel.
Sure.
Just I feel really blessed in a lot of ways, and the pandemic is horrible.
I've got some quick fire questions to warm us up before we get into some storytelling. So I'm giving you an either or option here, and you can respond however you want to. Tea or coffee?
Coffee.
Dogs or cats?
Neither.
Oh,
no more animals.
No. Central Park or Alphabet City?
Flushing Meadow Park.
Oh, right. Okay.
Queens forever.
Queens forever. Okay. AOC territory. Mountain or ocean?
Ocean, clearly. Although, yeah, ocean.
Mad Max or Waterworld?
Waterworld.
Why?
I've never actually seen the original Mad Max. I've only seen Beyond Thunderdome. Okay.
Yeah, it's probably terrifying, huh? Mind you, Waterworld as well, but there's some good swimming action in there. I remember at the time it was like, this is the most expensive movie that's ever been made, because they built a whole island at sea, didn't they? And it was like a complete flop. And then people started going, no, this is great. This is just a weird, wonderful film. Optimist or realist?
Realist, I guess. Yeah, I don't skew towards optimism.
No, in your line of work, it's a surprising trait when you come across a real optimist. You have to sort of go, hold on a second. So the gloom is my beat, in inverted commas, on your Twitter handle. What's that a reference to?
It's a joke. Actually, it started when I was at PopSci. I sat next to another reporter, Mary Beth Griggs, and she covered a lot of natural hazards like earthquake, like geological ones, like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. And I was covering a lot of like natural hazards that were more climate linked, so hurricanes, wildfires. And our then editor teased that she was doom and I was gloom, and put a little like like Dolce & Gabbana style logo on our adjoining cubicles. And it just made me laugh. And so I jokingly put it on Twitter, 4 years ago now, that gloom is my beat, and I've kind of never left it because it just makes me laugh.
It makes you laugh and it confuses everyone else. It's the perfect thing to have on your social channel. And the other thing that I picked up on your Twitter, you said, I think you're at the start of the year spending less time on Twitter and more time on passion projects.
Yeah, and that was a lie. I did not predict January 6th and an impeachment. And it's been 2021, it's not stopped. But I have been less than in the past, but I'm still on Twitter way too much.
Sure. And tell us a little bit. I want to hear the longer backstory, but tell us, what are the kind of passion projects that you're exploring at the moment, or are they all top secret?
No, they're not all top secret, and they're not all quote unquote productive. So one that I've been doing is, do you know what a Girl Scout patch is? I've been making quarantine Girl Scout patches of things that I've learned to do in quarantine or things that I've done in quarantine. So I like learned how to shuck an oyster in quarantine. I have one that's just like the sun setting. Well, it's not done yet, but I can, like, it's a patch I have it like drawn. I haven't stitched it yet, embroidered yet, of like the sun setting of the ocean. And then I guess in theory, at the end of the pandemic, I'll like buy a jean jacket and stitch it on the jacket or something. I haven't quite figured out what I'm going to do with the patches at the end, but yeah.
I love this. You're rewarding yourself new life skills, and then you're creating the actual, trophies to stitch onto your future clothing.
And then it'll be like like a kind of like a quilt or something, like a memory of this time, so we don't forget. Yeah, we all need these little sort of gamified, motivating things, don't we, to like push us on. And I sometimes feel in this digital world, where everyone's on their mindfulness apps and so on, and they're getting their streaks and so on, and we're the same, right, with our reading habits. But it's sometimes like, where's the actual, like, with my kids, I'm like, they love like the gold stars. And I don't think we grow out of that, do we? And clearly you don't. Like, you won your patches. That's really cool. So in terms of your relationship with climate and challenges and the crisis that we're in, where did that begin for you? What was your first sort of like uprising within, was like, this is something I really care about? I think probably the tail end of college, I started taking classes in environmental studies and environmental policy, but I didn't really, and so that's when I started like caring about quote unquote the environment, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do with that probably until like 5 or 6 years ago. Like I've always sort of been writing and I've always been sort of interested in the environment, but it's only relatively recently that I kind of really made a concerted effort to stitch the two together and realize that that was like the thing I could do about it, if that makes any sense. Oh, it's like 100 careers worth of work to do. And when you made those decisions to take those classes, was that, what was the motivation at that moment? I met a friend my junior year, I want to say, who had taken a class in rural sociology called Society and Environment, and she wouldn't shut up about the professor. So I just like on a lark kind of took the class. Okay, so she was like, this person's inspiring, go learn. Basically, yeah. So our teachers really do shape us. And then to sort of bring us up to speed to like how you ended up writing this book, Greenwashed. Yeah, so basically I graduated from college and I did the thing that you do in your 20s where you bounce around a lot, and I moved to France for a while and I worked a bunch of jobs, and then I ended up going to grad school for sustainable development, and I was doing an internship sort of on the tail end of that grad program working for an environmental consulting firm. And I looked around the office and everyone had these, at the time, these stainless steel or aluminum water bottles, and everyone had them but me because I kept losing them. And it made me wonder, and I had this like secondhand shame because I felt like the least environmental person in the office because I didn't have this water bottle, which didn't make any sense because the office was in a sustainability consulting firm. So like I was drinking out of a drinking glass. It wasn't like I was drinking out of a disposable container. And so it made me start wondering what was kind of the carbon footprint of me constantly losing them. I would just leave them places, like in a gas station. I left one in a bar. And then like by the time I remembered, it was often too late to go back for it. So sort of like looking into this, the carbon footprint of my reusable water bottles, kind of spiraled into looking at sort of what is the footprint of all of these so-called green things. And what the book kind of points out rightly is something that I think is much more common knowledge now, but was less common when it published in 2012, which is the idea that like individual actions only get you so far. And oftentimes we're focused on the wrong things. So at the time, electric cars were not really a thing yet. So I mostly focused on hybrid vehicles. And when I looked at hybrid vehicles, I felt like the question that we weren't asking ourselves, we were so focused on like what the fuel of the vehicle, like what the car was operating on. We weren't asking the bigger question about like, what is the carbon footprint of a road? Like they're all, and like, how does having a car facilitate where we live, and what happens to, how does that fragment ecosystems, right? Like there are all of these kind of downwind effects from owning the automobile, but we get so focused on like the carbon emissions of the car itself that we don't look at sort of the broader environmental impact of car infrastructure. And the book kind of does that. It doesn't look so much at traditional greenwashing, you know, like sort of like you kind of expect like Exxon or BP to kind of come out with these slogans to try and clean up these images. It's more the other side where we get so fixated on what we can do as quote unquote consumers that we're not looking at the big sort of social and system scale.
And that goes to the center of the challenges citizens and consumers that we often feel, which is like, okay, we want to act, we want to do something, but it's either, you know, government policy has to change, or big corporate, you know, the infrastructure of how our world works, or kind of like everything else is futile. Is that the conclusion you reached in Greenwash?
Yeah, kind of, but one of the things that I point out, and I think it's really important to hone in on government, because we often treat government as a thing, especially if you're living in a democracy, as a thing that happens to us and a thing that happens outside of us, and a thing that we show up once every 2 years or once every 4 years based on US election cycles. But it is very much, at least in the US, it's very much anchored in this rhetoric around the election. And what I think Greenwash gets at, and what I think the podcast especially gets at, is this idea of governments as participatory and something that we all need to be responsible for, and something that we need to take part in as much as we take responsibility for what we choose to buy at the grocery store.
Sure, exactly. So it's that plus action there. And I think that the challenge then, certainly for me, is then you either see yourself in on the picket line with Extinction Rebellion, or it's kind of all or nothing, like the collectivism feels like, is that really having an impact? And so from a political perspective, it feels like it's hard for people who maybe haven't been actively involved before, but now really want to do something, to know where to start.
And I think that's where, so one of the interesting things with the podcast is it is so solutions focused, that what we're trying to give people are inroads and ways that they can get involved. It is very US focused. Sorry. But I think that the context, that like the things that we tell you to do, there's probably an equivalent of that where you live. So like we did an episode on preparing for disasters, for natural hazards. And one of the things that we talked about is like, what is a disaster plan for your community? And you should probably find out, who is your disaster planner? I'm sure that like where you live in the UK or where you live somewhere else, there is still a disaster planner. They might have a different name, but like, or title, but like there's someone in your community that's still responsible for those things. And so in that sense, it's sort of like, it's transferable, you know, like the terminology may shift depending on where you are, but the actual things that we're telling you to do, that is very transferable.
Yeah. And the podcast is great. It's called, Farah's asking where to find it. It's called How to Save a Planet, on all the podcast channels. And it's got this soundtrack, which immediately makes you feel like everything's going to be fixed.
Emma Munger made it. One of our producers actually made it herself, which is like really impressive.
Now this brings me to like the squad, the community, the little collective that you're part of with this podcast, but also this book, All We Can Save. And I crossed paths briefly with Ayanna through a school called the Think School, creative leadership school. And so I've been following her for the last few years, and it's amazing to see this project come together. Tell us how this collective has formed and how this project came together and your part in it.
Yeah, it's all Ayanna. I met Ayanna like 4 years ago at an event at some place in New York City. And, you know, we sort of just loosely communicated since then. And she reached out to me maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and was like, I'm putting together this anthology. These amazing women are working on it. Do you want to contribute something? And I said yes. And she's really great at like collecting humans. And I mean that lovingly. So yeah, this is definitely driven by Ayanna and for me anyway, and Catherine, really tapping into their broader sort of climate and eco-justice networks.
Yeah, and it's, you know what, so I've made a personal effort out of curiosity and concern to we're in the reading game here at Rebel Book Club, but to really up my reading game around climate. I read Naomi Klein for years, and On Fire she writes a chapter in here from that book, which is fantastic. But there's obviously a big wave of books in this space now, and The Uninhabitable Earth, which was the one I think that's I don't know if you know, I've lent it out, but that's the one that kind of made a big impact last year on people who are interested in this space, because it's so visceral. Like, you can't read that book and not be emotionally like, you know, wound up by it all. It's really intense. But for a lot of people, these diving into these topics feels overwhelming. My sense of just, and I've only read a dozen of the essays in All We Can Save, and there's poetry as well and so on. But my sense is that this is why it's succeeding, and I'm really enjoying. I'm using the word enjoying it as I get into it. Is because it's all these different voices, and you can feel this energy, and it is bleak, of course, because it's a crisis. But yeah, how did you end up writing Wakanda Doesn't Have Suburbs, the essay, and how did it fit in? Did you get told, oh, right, you're going to write in the bit about reframing, or did you just say, hey, here's my idea?
No, actually, Ayana thought that I would write something different because there's a topic that I'm not going to tell you about that I've been looking into on the side. And I was like, actually, the thing that I want to write about is like systems and framing. And I just really love the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I've seen every movie in it. And I remembered around the time that Ayana was asking me, I remembered reading a lot about how much about the world building that they used to bring Wakanda to screen, and how it was very unusual from a developer perspective. Like from an urban planning perspective, it was an unusual city. And then I rewatched it again, and like I watched like the opening credits, like frame by frame.
Wow.
Or well, not like the opening credits, but like there's a seat like when they first enter into Wakanda.
Okay. By the way, for those that they're like, we're Kendra, take us deep into this film, but this is Black Panther, right? So
yes, it's Black Panther.
If you haven't been following, Disney Plus or other, films by Marvel in the last few years, then you might have missed it. But it is.
I mean, there were only like 26 of them or something. What,
true.
People have other things to do besides watch every movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe?
So Wakanda, for those that don't know, is what? It's the city.
Yeah, so Wakanda is like a country, really. It's a country in sub-Saharan Africa that was never colonized. It's kind of a huge part of its identity, and has this magical material called vibranium, which is this endless supply of energy and technology, and that has allowed them to the outside world look like this sort of developing country and pastoralist country, when in reality they're this incredibly technologically complex and high-tech society, almost futuristic. And they pretend in their cloak to the broader world is that they're this like developing country that's mostly made up of pastoralists, but in reality they're like incredibly futuristic and have technology that are sort of light years beyond the rest of the world. And the reason that I referenced it so much or use it as sort of the anchor thought in the piece is because when you go into Wakanda for the first time in the movie Black Panther, the first thing you see is this beautiful lush mountainscape, and you do see the rural pastoralists, and then you see Wakanda. So you go straight from rural countryside to city center. There's no suburbs in Wakanda, and there are also no like real, I don't want to say real roads, but like the roads are mostly pedestrian walkways. It's mass transit. There's a train that runs through the whole city, but then there's also like kind of like a trolley system. And the road itself, like and it's mixed. So like this trolley kind of intermingles with people. So that it means it's going at human scale. It's almost like in some ways the streetcars of the turn of the century in the US. And most importantly, the streetscape is not paved, or at least it doesn't look paved. It might be made of some magical material that looks not paved, but is also super absorbent, which we know matters because from a urban heat island effect, we know that that having so many paved surfaces traps heat. It means stormwater runoff go not be absorbed. Like there are just all of these downstream effects by having so many paved city surfaces in a city.
So coming back to Wakanda, and I guess the point of the story, putting it into this book.
Yeah, is a point. And what struck me in watching Black Panther is that they created this world that was at least, quite sustainable, but also it was one of the few times that I'd really seen on screen the idea of a culture or society. And there are problems with Wakanda because it's like a monarchy and other things, but like just from an ecological perspective, that was green and sustainable and wasn't sort of either portrayed as backwards or kind of like a prelude to something, hiding something horrible within that place, right? Like so often, when you watch a movie that something terrible is going to happen, because if it looks too beautiful, if it looks too lush, if it looks too like healthy, our at least in the US, our default culture is that like, oh, there must be something really wrong with them. Yeah. There must be some terror lurking below the surface that we can't see.
Yeah, and you use the example in your essay of Avatar as well. You know, it's all going well till the humans come along and then destroy it. So this is the big question here: is like, is the reason we've got to this crisis point of destroying nature and ultimately ourselves? Is it a failure of language, which is ultimately the reason we've thrived as a species, right? The ability to communicate. Has it also been the thing that's created the crisis?
I wouldn't say it's a failure of language. I would say it's a failure of storytelling, because it's useful to remember that there is not a single language, and not everybody in the world has equally contributed to climate change, and we're not all telling the same story. We're not, the United States has a large storytelling about westward expansion. We have a lot of storytelling around conquering. We don't have a lot of storytelling around sort of living in harmony with other people, right? So like, I think it's less a question of language and more a question of how we use language to create these stories and what stories we're using it to create.
Yeah, and in your work, you're a storyteller and a writer. Where are you seeing this? This book is the example, right? I know, yeah. But where else are you seeing the art of storytelling helping tackle this crisis head on effectively?
Yeah, that is a really good question, and you've totally put me on the spot.
Well, I think like from my observation is, the indigenous communities and cultures and populations, including in or especially in the US, when their stories do get to the surface, because they have the strongest relationship with the land, right, out of all human population, then it becomes really powerful, because you're then like, wow, okay, we should really probably pay attention to the people that have been living and are still trying to live in harmony with their local environment, who really are sustainable.
Yeah, because the Yurok tribe in California gets a ton of attention, because for a really, 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 really long time, the default for fire suppression in the United States, the default for dealing with wildfire was fire suppression. And a lot of the indigenous tribes, and the Yurok in particular, have been fighting for quite some time to bring fire back to the land. They said that fire was really important in terms of keeping fire in check, and they were right. And so we're only beginning now to sort of like bring back that knowledge kind of really broadly, sort of over the past 20 to 30 years. And they've only relatively recently regained the right to set fire to their own lands. And all of that is like one of the things that I think climate change is forcing us to do. Man,
oh no! It's like, I think Kendra could almost see that coming. I don't know. It's like she's like, oh, it's just before the freeze. So Kendra, you were just getting to a really good point and I lost track of it now.
I think I was talking about like the Yurok tribe and one of the things that I think climate change is teaching us is that the ways in which we've dealt with problems traditionally has been wrong, and that in order to deal with the multiple effects of climate change, we need more holistic solutions. We can't just revert automatically to sort of the most, like, if you have a lot of fire, we're going to put the fire out, right? Because that creates downstream effects. Like, we need to sort of think more broadly, like, what are the solutions we're actually trying to solve for?
And is it the case that the solutions, I mean, it feels like from everything I've read and the little I've learned so far is that the solutions are there, and it's a matter of telling the right story, the willpower, and then there's the question of the system itself. So this was going on in the chat while we were talking, the reference to Bill Gates's new book coming out, and he's obviously he almost have a sort of monopoly of PR. So in the UK this week is like everywhere, like the BBC was sponsoring his book launch or something, which seems a bit weird. But the point is, there's a lot of pushback on it around, hold on a second, it's a classic billionaire saying there's a tech solution, but it's still within this model of capitalism. Should our response be to that? We need all hands on deck. Bill Gates has got huge resource, brain power, influence. Great. If he's 100% focused on it, he's a problem solver. That's good news. Or do we really need to challenge how we go about tackling the climate crisis and say, no, actually, that model really is, because it's going to influence government decisions and market behavior in a big way. That's not, we need to challenge his approach. What's your perspective when you see these things, whether it's an Elon Musk or a Bill Gates or whoever it is jumping in?
I think for me, the question is, I'm living in how do I raise this? There are 500,000 dead people in the United States because we did not contain COVID-19. And so if we are looking for climate solutions that allow us to replicate the same systems that we currently have here that allow for the death of 500,000 people, that allow for systemic racism, that allow for sexism, then those aren't solutions. There are solutions that we know that are not just about fixing climate change, but are about making this planet and this country more habitable. And those are the solutions that we need to turn towards. And so I think we really need to think critically about the things that people are saying, because, many times what people in positions of privilege and positions of power are saying are things that will allow them to shore up those positions and sort of like maintain their status quo, because the status quo is really working for them. But for people in the United States, it's not working for the vast majority of us.
It's such an important point. The environmental and social justice are inextricably linked. And actually, when that settles in your mind and you really, really understand that, and I think I'm only halfway there personally to fully understanding it, it then becomes really exciting because you realize that you solve a problem here, it solves the problem. It's the whole thing. So Susanna's picking up a question. I'm going to come to others who have joined us in the room here as well. In terms of solutions and changes you'd like to see, where do we start? So let's say next week you're in the Oval Office with Biden, and he's like, Kendra, what should we focus on? Like, I've got the money. What should we do? Like, where do you think we should zoom in?
In the United States, oh man, there are multiple prong of one, we need to fix the grid, right? Like, that's a huge one. I don't know if you have followed what's been going on in Texas, where like a huge chunk of the state lost power because they lost both gas and wind at the same time. They weren't able to the wind. Yeah, I don't want to get into details. So one, just sort of functionally, is like fix the grid, but also fix energy scarcity. Like, there are people in this country that don't actually have electricity in their homes. They either can't afford it or they're not in a place where there's connectivity. And so fixing the grid enables us to do sort of the things that we need to do in order to have more renewable power, and doing it in such a way that it enables people who have been traditionally underserved by utilities to be better served. And it sounds really weird to be focusing on energy, but we know that energy and access to like energy and electricity has all of these downstream health effects. So like, it's not a small thing to actually have electricity in your home. It's an incredibly beneficial thing. Like, how do you store food properly without good electricity, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, think of all the downstream effects. So that's just one that's like on the top of my mind. Yeah, I mean, oh man, I think the reason that I'm struggling with your question is because we often phrase it as like, what is the thing that we need to do first? And the reality is we need to do a lot of things at the same time. And so fixing the grid is one thing, scaling up renewable energy is another thing, changing zoning so that, road building is not there's a real question if public transit will survive COVID, because the way public transit is funded in the United States is heavily dependent on ridership. And for obvious reasons, a lot of people are not taking public transit right now. And so putting the money where your mouth is and spending less money on car infrastructure and spending a lot more money on public transit and doing it in ways so it's reliable and it's clean and it's safe and using and treating it like a public good, so that the expectation, which is rare, like not every, many countries who have really good transit systems don't have this expectation, but the expectation in the United States is that mass transit will pay for itself. We don't expect roads to pay for themselves. So it's wild that like that's saying something, that's saying what we're prioritizing.
Yeah.
When you and the reality is to get people out of cars and into mass transit, you're going to have to run mass transit empty for quite some time. You're going to have to get people to trust that infrastructure will be there. And then it will get to the point that people leave their cars for that mass transit infrastructure. If you build it, they will come, but you have to let it run. If you start running it and people don't immediately start taking it, and then you cut that system, well, you've now de-incentivized people from riding that mass transit. And you need to think through how you're planning. Like right before COVID happened, there was this huge plan to redo New York City's bus systems, bus lines, because they were like, these are 100 years old, they're not the most efficient. And when they came back and they started presenting these bus plans, people were outraged, because one of the things the planners hadn't thought through is that over 100 years, infrastructure had developed around those bus routes. So they were now creating and designing new bus lines that were faster, but they were bus lines essentially to nowhere. They went down streets that people didn't need to go to. They prioritized access points that people didn't need to get to. there was no recognition of what transit is actually supposed to do. They were treating it very mechanistically, which is like, we're going to get you from point A to point B in the fastest way possible, and we're going to determine in advance where we think you want to go, as opposed to recognizing that like there are stores, there are shops, there are churches that were built up around these infrastructure, and if you now have to go 3 blocks out of the way to get to that church, you're actually making it less convenient, not more convenient for people.
Yes. Yeah. Wow. There you go. So we've got policy number 1 nailed. No, but it's, I like put you on the spot, Kendra, but you've got the answer. Like this transitions, however you look at it, you can simplify it in the numbers. Like Bill Gates is quite good at communicating that. You know, we've got 51 million, billion of this, and we've got 0. We've got to get down, and that's it. It's whatever it takes. But of course, that doesn't consider the social justice issue necessarily, and it's complicated. But that's why the education and the storytelling is key, which is what you're doing. Loads of questions coming in. I'm going to read out a couple. Here we go. Louisa is asking, can Kendra comment on if she views this as the end of civilization? Here we go. Is a cheery one. I like the Roman civilization ending with the plague, economic crisis, etc. If so, how and where can we look to see what the new version or new civilization would be? So yeah, is it like in your mind? Is it going to? Do you see this playing out? And I watched the David Attenborough Netflix doc, and you know I've grown up with him. And read his book recently, and for the first time you're like, oh wow, he's really saying that the 6th extinction of nature is on the horizon. It's within, you know, a generation from us now. It could happen if things go badly. Where do you feel like do you see that it's going to be mass disruption before renewal, or do you think it's still possible with everything you've learned to change before huge fallout happens?
I think 2 things. I don't know that much about Roman history, but you know, Romans weren't the world. There were entire continents that were untouched by European civilization, and so I think the perils are not there because climate change is touching every part of the world. Roman civilization only touched a small corner of the world, so there just aren't strong parallels there.
There were no travel corridors in Roman times. Certainly air ones.
And I think the broader question is I think there will be disruption. I think the question is whether it'll be disruption or whether it'll be transformation. There will be change or evolution regardless. I lean more towards the transformation and the evolution side versus like the chaotic disruption side. But I also think that people, because history is so often told by the winners, you know, as the cliche goes, I think people downplay the degree to which, you know, even the Industrial Revolution was a massive disruption for so many people. You know, colonialization was a massive disruption. And so the question is are we going to have a massive disruption in which more people benefit as opposed to more people get harmed? And I think it is possible that more people benefit, but we have to make that our priority.
Well, that's a great answer. Thank you. Ben asks, we're jumping all over the place here, Kendra. This is a good challenge. Does Kendra have a view on taking carbon out of the atmosphere, sequestration, as it's known, and how this could be financed? What does it look like? What's the model of? So
there are 2 kind of buckets of carbon sequestration, or taking carbon out of the atmosphere. There's like carbon capture and sequestration when it's like attached to like a fossil fuel plant, and I think that doesn't work. And actually, the only one attempted in the United States actually just shut down last fall, and it needed a second natural gas plant to generate enough electricity to sequester the carbon. So like the real question is how much energy it takes out. There's an argument, and it's true, that we do need to remove carbon from the atmosphere. I don't know if we have the capability to do that in terms of financing it. If we can do it in a way that, you know, doesn't generate more CO2 emissions or doesn't negate other forms, doesn't force us to consume more fossil fuels in other ways. Personally, the people who should pay for the people who contributed the most of the problem, so it should be countries like the United States. It's just sort of like my off the cuff answer. Like obviously, like countries like Guatemala and Honduras, who are suffering disproportionately from greenhouse gas emissions and have contributed very little to the problem, should not be the one on the hook financially for this.
Totally. And it's this, I saw a great graphic in, can't remember which book it was. Oh, yes, it was this one, Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World, Jason Hickel, about the proportion of like the causes. And of course, the US is significant and Europe's 30%, and like the US is 50%. And then you all the rest of the world. And then yet they're on the front line, the majority of them, as we're already seeing. Kathy, a question from earlier says, can Kendra tell us something about the other writers in the book? Are all the views shared? Is everyone on the same page, or is it how did it play out?
Yeah, so I'm going to guess that not everyone is on the same page, only because Catherine and Ayana reached out to women in the space that they knew, or that through word of mouth, and they got them together and they curated it. But we did not see each other's works before the book came out, so I'm just going to guess. Like, this is just like naked guess that like you don't get that many different voices together and assume that they all agree on everything. And I think that was kind of the strength of the book, is that it is a diversity of thoughts and opinions. But this is a guess, but yeah, I don't think we all agree.
Yeah, from what I've read, it also is kind of what makes it different to the other books on this topic. Is it's not just one voice. It's a quilt. What do you have a
tapestry?
Quilt? Tapestry. That's the word. Thank you. So it works really well actually. I was like, oh, there's a poem here, and then I'm into some deep science, and now I'm into like a visionary story of the future, and it works really well. It kind of washes over you and sparks all sorts of things. So it's such a great project. Couple more questions from the team here. We've got about 10 minutes or so, Kendra, if you can keep firing away with us. You're doing such a great job. Thank you. Sam is saying, is BP investing in US offshore wind greenwashing or essential investments to enable us to make the change? So from what you can see in the fossil fuel, the big companies, are they going beyond greenwashing yet, or is it all still?
So the question, you have to wait. So prior to the BP oil spill on the Gulf Coast, BP made the whole that was around the time that BP rebranded from British Petroleum to quote unquote Beyond Petroleum, and they adopted that sun logo, and they put solar, at least in the US, I don't know what they did in the UK. They put solar panels on their gas stations, and they did this huge, and they bought like, I think, like a PV, or like they committed some amount of money, a few $1 million to producing electricity from photovoltaics. And then right after the BP oil spill, they took this small amount of money that they had committed to photovoltaics and sold that division. So they just underwent this massive oil spill, invested, it must have been like 10 million. It was like, a rounding error on their balance sheet, but enabled them to sort of make all of this hoopla around, their rebranding and their pivoting. And then right after they dumped, like, I think it still is the largest oil spill in American history, they turned around and sold their renewable energy division, right? So like, I don't know the answer. I think that a lot of people are giving them a lot of attention and not putting that piece of information in what they're telling the public, which is like, maybe it is a genuine pivot on their part, but that the only way we can tell is after the fact. We can't tell now.
And it may be that COVID is causing peak oil right now, which, it's a horrible thing, but actually one of the silver linings might be that oil is now going down.
Maybe, but yeah, it is going down economically, but the oil companies, and we did a podcast on this, and I'm going to revisit this in the future, but the oil companies are making a concerted effort to pivot from oil as fuel to oil as plastic. And IEA last year did a report where they said something like GHG emissions from fossil fuels will go up, and like 14% of it is coming from this pivot to plastics. In the United States, fracking natural gas makes no money. So, Shell built a massive cracker plant in Pennsylvania in the attempts of taking this fracked gas and turning it into plastic that they can then ship off to sub-Saharan Africa and turn into sachet, have companies down there turn them into sachets that are very difficult to recycle. And in fact, most plastic products we know aren't recyclable. And it was the plastics industry, at least in the United States, actually lobbied states to put the recycling symbol on all of these plastic containers that don't actually get recycled and can't be recycled, and they knew it.
And
so,
then the trust is broken, right?
Right?
All that hard work, like building that up. Yeah.
So that's why I said, like, this is a thing that if they are committed to, we will know after the fact, but it is impossible to say ahead of time. And you should be rightfully skeptical because of their past and repeated behaviors.
Got it. Amy's got a great question here. It seems so much of our societal hesitancy to tackle the climate crisis comes from the feeling that it doesn't affect us directly now. Very sort of selfish, sort of like the house isn't on fire.
Mm-hmm.
I'm living in a perfectly comfortable life. Why do I need to change anything? And also, I think on top of what Amy's saying there, it's also like there's a lot of shit I am dealing with, especially at this moment, right? That's much more.
I don't know. Everything is fine. What are you talking about?
What? So how do we utilize our storytelling to make people really care about and realize that it does affect us in serious ways? And, you know, we've seen Greta Thunberg and the Sunrise and the School Strikers movement and Extinction Rebellion all within 3 or 4 years. That's been paused during the pandemic, at least, you know, up front. Like that has brought it forward, but it doesn't for maybe the influential majority, it's still not a priority, right?
I think in the US, well, so I think it depends on which population of person you're talking about. I think it also depends on, I think in the US, 2017, 2018 were turning points because they were just such bad disaster years. 2017, California was on fire. And then 2018, California caught fire again. And then Australia caught fire. And Hurricane Harvey was in 2017. And that was the summer of like, that was the same summer that there was it Irma that hit Barbuda, and everybody saw like the giant eye of the storm and how it was bigger than the entire island. Like the hurricane was bigger than the island of Barbuda. And that was, I think, the tipping point for a lot of people in the US. And then there have just been really like, this is a thing that I do where I often need to remind people, like, I don't tweet about climate change like incessantly. It's not like my Twitter, I don't know what my Twitter personality is, but it's not like I don't just tweet about climate change. I kind of pick and choose my battles. And with COVID, for obvious reasons, I've been a little bit more COVID focused. But last week or the week before, a lot of people in New York were kind of losing their damn minds because New York had like 2 back-to-back snowstorms. And one was like a lot of snow, but the other one was just like a normal snowstorm. And so I did this tweet that went, for me anyway, kind of viral, which was like, all of you in New York who are complaining about the weather, welcome. This is what New York City weather used to be like before our climate shifted. Our climate officially shifted like a year ago from like, I think it was humid continental to humid subtropical or something.
So that's official.
It's official. We literally shifted climates. And so I was like, it used to be normal for New York City to just have snow on the ground from like December to March. Like that was normal and fine. That was like very common. And also I'm young enough that when I went to college, I had email and Wi-Fi. So like me telling you like this is my memory. I'm not like your great grandparents, you know, telling you about the day before the internal combustion engine. And the reason I think it resonated with so many people is because we're already beginning to, partly because I think New York just has a lot of transient people, so people who don't know what it used to be. But one woman even, she chimed in and she was like, I've lived in New York for 4 years and it's hardly snowed at all. I thought the movies were lying to me. And I was like, no, the movies were telling the truth. It's just that New York's climate has shifted. And so now any movie that you sort of watched that was filmed in like the 80s and the 90s that had all of these snowy scenes, that's just like not a regular reality anymore. And I think that really resonated with people because it does that. It creates these markers of change that make people kind of freak out a little bit, but in a good way, I think, because it's like not catastrophic, right? Like these are not people, this is not like everyone you know will immediately die. This is like, oh no, climate change really is real and we should probably do something about it.
Yeah.
But
in the meantime, you know, you've got the cyclones and hurricanes that are killing thousands, and the east coast of southern Africa and Mozambique, and the bushfires in Australia, which were like unprecedentedly bad. And it was a huge disaster, but wasn't on the same scale in terms of human deaths and yet the headline, like the news story, was all about Australia, right? And then the same in California. So are you saying we have to wait until the climate crisis physically hits the shores and the land?
I'm not saying we have to wait, but I'm saying that like there are these opportunities that when they present themselves, these are really good times to remind people that climate change is a factor. Like the polar vortex that just hit, I was like, you know, there's a climate link, so I like retweeted that because it's on people's mind. You want to get people when they're in that space because that's the easiest time to remind them.
Yeah.
And to create those links for people.
And as you're saying all this, it also makes you think. It reminds me of the power of cognitive dissonance, because we've seen it so much in recent times in the UK and the US and elsewhere. And during COVID, people dying of COVID when they've denied it the day before. We don't want to talk about like the insurrection and everything that happened, but like, no, there was no incident. No one did that, and it happened in Congress. Yeah. No, he didn't do it. Of course he didn't do it. So it's still that, there's still that. And I guess linked to that, and maybe to start to like wrap up our conversation this evening, although we could go on forever, but you have lots to do, I'm sure. So is around how can we as individuals help tell the story better? So Madison is asking the question about, so someone who you're close to in your family, who doesn't feel like this is a priority or like doesn't understand why we should be taking it seriously. How do you approach that topic?
Can I punt?
Sorry.
So we actually did an entire episode about this, how to have difficult conversations around climate change. And so what I would recommend is you listen to that episode. I can tell you sort of, we interviewed, oh God, I'm forgetting his name. We interviewed we interviewed both an expert on having these difficult conversations and a congressperson who did not used to believe in climate, a Republican congressperson who did not believe in climate change and then eventually came to accept the science. And part of how he came to accept the science is because his son did accept the science of climate change and had these conversations with him. And so the most critical thing, and there are many steps that they lay out, but the most critical thing is recognize that this is not a one-off conversation, that you need to have this conversation multiple times. And so if you're not willing to have that conversation multiple times, then this is probably not a person you should start the conversation with. The other thing that Kate Marvel also talks a lot about is appealing to the institutions that this person values. So Kate Marvel's a climate scientist, and she's, I believe, in the book. And her dad didn't accept the science for quite a long time. And so she pointed out that like the insurance industry and the military were taking climate change seriously. Those are two institutions that her father respected. And so the fact that they were incorporating climate change into their planning meant more to him in some ways than the fact that his climate scientist daughter was telling him that the climate was changing. So finding those things that resonate with that person and pointing to them is one way that you can get to them.
Yeah, start where they are. I think that's a great solution, and the podcast episode on that we'll share with the notes after this, with the follow up on this. All the links noted tonight. The other thing that I've noticed has worked really well is obviously doing. So it's a role modeling rather than trying to sit down and explain it, because it is hard. Although actually it's not that complicated in the end of things. Like, we're warming up the planet. It's not good news. The reality is like if you know your relationship with that individual is, you don't like arguing, you don't like debating, you're stuck with them for life, or like, then, okay, what are you reading, Kendra? Oh, I'm reading this new, why are you reading that? Okay. I recommend this film and blah, blah, blah. It's the actions, right? That often is the most powerful. And then to wrap up, we've got an epic question from Ali here. So, I'd love to hear Kendra's vision for the future. Will we have the same lifestyle? I guess this depends whether you're feeling realistic or quietly optimistic. What will change? Will we be more involved in our communities? Will we be eating different food? Will we be traveling less? What will work be valued more? This is a whole new book, Ali, you're asking Kendra. So yeah, is Wakanda possible? Do you think like that? Is that vision going to ever happen?
I don't know if Wakanda is possible because vibranium doesn't exist, but I will say not yet anyway. I will say that one of the things that I think about a lot is that, like, when you look at the transportation piece, at least in the United States, we used to have different forms of transportation. We used to have more, like, even small rural communities had trolleys that connected them to larger, communities. And so I do think, and I do hope, at least in the United States, that the way we get around and how we live, like, spatially will be different. And we know that that's also important because how we live spatially, like moving into these areas of wildland urban interface is an excellent way of actually beginning another pandemic and creating more zoonotic diseases. In the United States, in the Northeast where I am, Lyme disease emerged in part because of suburbanization. More and more people, I don't want to get into too much detail, but like that kind of encroaching on that wildland area and shifting the ecosystem in a way such that there were both more abundant numbers of their host species, which is a type of mouse, and we became more in contact with it. So like again, it's not just the environment, it's these downstream events.
And
effects, rather.
Of course. And I said that was the last question, but just to tack onto it, how are you going to live in the future? Do you have a clear, like, can you see in your mind's eye, this is where I want to know?
No.
What does it look like in your head? Are you kind of like, I'm just going to respond to what my purpose is with my work and the needs and what I enjoy, or do you not even think about it?
I'm thinking about it just I think about it in very short terms, and also like I'm living in a state and I'm living in a place that, had you asked me, I'd never been to this town before I agreed to live to here. So like clearly I have some impulse issues.
Positive issues to me. If we're like, get out of the city, go to the ocean. If we're going to be in lockdown, that's okay.
Yeah. So I definitely have no idea.
No idea. And yeah, I kind of, it's an interesting point to wrap up on, because you're so, you're trained as a scientist and a writer to be very clear about everything, and yet personally you're like, who knows? Is that uncomfortable, or is that just an acceptance of the reality?
I mean, it is both uncomfortable and it is an acceptance of the reality. Like part of that, the thing that factors into my decision making is like, it depends on what we do, right? Like I would love to stay in New York City, but it really depends on whether or not New York City is making the things that it needs to do to adapt to climate change. Otherwise, New York City is a terrible place to live in a warming world. It's a bad choice for many, many reasons. It's coastal, it's hot, it's humid. It's a great place for mosquito-borne diseases. Like it's a great place for it's increasingly a great place for hurricanes. It's a great place for flooding. So like, is it the place that I should be staking my future on? I have no idea. No. It really depends on how the city and how the country and how the world is choosing to respond on climate change, and recognize. I think the thing that my current residence really illustrates is my ability to recognize that things are going to be terrible and plan accordingly. When I agreed to move, officially my job was only work from home. I agreed to move in July, and officially my job was only work from home until January. And I was just sort of like, that's not going to happen. I was like, it won't be, I was like, they're not going to want us in the office until July 2021 at the earliest. And so I just like willfully signed the lease without asking anyone's permission. And I was just like, it'll work out. And like 2 weeks after I signed the lease, they were like, just kidding. We're work from home until July. And now they've pushed it back until September at minimum. So at that point, my lease will be up.
It's mad, isn't it? Oh, well, I think this, this is sort of culture of adaptation that certainly, whatever label we're going to give it, millennial generation is having to deal with in the workplace now with the pandemic, and with it, like it is a preparation for this crisis and what's going to happen, because there's going to be so much change. And that's for the privileged world, right? That's for those of us who are in the most fortunate position, but also right. in the position of most influence and impact as well in many ways. So thank you for the education and the quiet inspiration, like in terms of what's possible. I loved I'm going to gather my thoughts, as I'm sure everyone will, off the back of this. But one of the things I'm going to take away is this sort of like, when you're thinking about an individual action, what's the chain, what's the supply chain, an electric hybrid car, what about the roads and all this? And yes, we're not all ministers for transport, but we can learn about it and educate ourselves, which is what we're all about at Rebel Book Club, and then try and make the small changes in our lives and have those conversations, and most importantly, tell the story. And that's what I love about what this project's all about. So if you're into news stories of the world and what's going on, pick up All We Can Save, join the project online, get into the podcast. It's really uplifting and educational, and connect with Kendra and her rants and mayonnaise chat on Twitter. Kendra, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
We will share this far and wide after tonight. Everyone's saying thanks. Oh, there you are as well. Cool. Thank you, everybody. Go safe, enjoy the pancakes, and we'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye.